I get so caught up doing camera reviews and comparisons that I kind of forgot that there are people out there who just want a basic understanding of how their cameras work to shoot great looking video. So I'm gonna walk you through the essential things that every camera user should understand while they're shooting video. We're gonna start off with the exposure basics. I'm gonna talk about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And then I'm gonna break down how each one affects your depth of image, your sharpness, and your brightness. Then I'll explain to you how to base out your camera by choosing the right frame rate. I'm also going to talk to you about what resolution actually means and the importance of good audio and camera movement. My most important tip I'm going to save for the end, so make sure you stick around. This is not a sponsored video. It's not sponsored by any camera brand or by anyone. But if you'd like to support the channel, using the affiliate links in the description below means a lot and it keeps these videos coming. Now, if you do want to take a deeper dive into this particular topic, I created a full in-depth course called 3-Day Camera Jumpstart Video Basics 101, and it walks you through all of this subject matter step by step. I go over all of this stuff in a lot more detail while still keeping it pretty simple. This way you don't only learn it, but you also comprehend it as well. I'll leave a link to that course in the description. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Today, on the Film Alliance. Let's talk about what each exposure setting controls and why they're so important to understand. I'm going to share with you some of the real world scenarios that I found myself in the past where I was not in complete control of my exposure, and I'm going to show you some of the problem footage that I came home from after the shoot. Aperture controls the depth of field, or how much of your image is in focus from front to back. It's also referred to as f-stop. A lower f-stop number, like f1.8, means that you'll have a wider aperture, which will give you a shallower depth of field. This will also produce more of a background blur. A higher f-stop number, like f8 or f11, means that you're going to have a narrower aperture, and that keeps more of the image in focus from the foreground to the background. You'll also hear people say things like fast lens or fast aperture, and that just means that your lens can open up to a wide aperture like f1.8 or f2. These are called fast because they let more light in, allowing for a faster shutter speed. A slow aperture like f11 doesn't let in as much light, and it may require a longer exposure. Watch the background go from sharp with this higher f-stop to more blurry as we lower the f-stop down. This really matters when you're shooting two subjects at two different distances. If your aperture is too wide, one subject might be in focus in the foreground while the other one is blurred in the background. That's why for this shot I used a smaller aperture or a higher f-stop number, because I wanted both soccer players who were standing at different distances to both be in focus. And that's the other thing, aperture doesn't just affect depth of field, it also controls how much light hits the sensor. A lower aperture or a wider opening lets in more light, making your image a lot brighter. A higher aperture or a smaller opening lets in less light, which can make the image darker. So it seems to be a little bit confusing, but once you go out and you start playing around with your aperture, it all starts to make sense. Shutter speed is what controls how motion looks in your video. You can either use shutter speed to freeze fast action or give it a stuttery look, or you can use it to show a little bit more motion blur like what our human eyes see. But shutter speed doesn't only control the motion and how it looks, it also controls how much light comes in and hits the sensor, just like we had with aperture, but this is a little bit different. And before I explain to you how that works, just remember that the lower the shutter speed, the brighter your image. The higher your shutter speed, the dimmer your image. That's because the shutter is open for a short amount of time, letting in light, and it depends on how long that shutter door is open, which would determine how much light gets let in. Shutter speed controls how motion looks in your video. A slower shutter speed introduces motion blur. You'll see trails and softness in movement. This blur is natural looking and pleasing when used correctly, especially at standard video frame rates like 29.97 frames per second if you're here in the United States and a few other regions, and 25 frames per second if you're outside of that. But if your shutter speed is too slow, you get too much of a blur and it can almost look smeary or ghost-like, especially during subject movement on camera pans. That's what happened to me once when I did this interview. I tried to brighten up the shot by lowering the shutter speed, and this was my result. I got this weird motion trail effect on this subject who wasn't even moving that much. And this was shooting in 24 frames per second. On the other hand, if your shutter speed is too fast, you're gonna remove all of that motion blur. Every frame becomes extremely sharp. This might sound good, but it makes movement feel jittery or unnatural. especially for handheld shots for people walking. You'll see this sharp look in action movies during fight scenes or stressful scenes, but for normal footage, it just feels off. So that's how shutter speed affects motion. But now let's talk about how it affects your exposure. The longer your shutter is open, the brighter your image will be. The faster the shutter, the darker the image, because it doesn't stay open for long enough to gather as much light. So a faster shutter speed like 1/250 is gonna let in less light, whereas a slower shutter speed like 1/50 will let in a lot more light. In video, shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, like 1/50, 1/100, or 1/250. If your shutter speed is set to 1/50, that means each frame of your video is exposed for 1/50th of a second. And here's a simple way to picture it. Think of the shutter like the door to a store that's open on Black Friday. If it opens for just a moment, only gets a few people in there, the few people in this example is the light. If it's only open for just a fraction of a second, only a little bit of light will get in. If it stays open for longer, more light will come in. But that longer opening time also allows movement to blur into the frame, which creates motion blur. So to sum it up, lower shutter speeds equal more light and more motion blur. Higher shutter speeds equal less light and sharper individual frames, and it can look jittery. I'm going to talk about how shutter speed and frame rates live together once we get to basing out our camera, but first let's talk about ISO. When it comes to ISO, if you're in a low light setting and you crank up your ISO, you're going to make your image a lot brighter, but it's going to introduce graininess and noise into your image, and it quickly diminishes the quality and crispness of your video. Every single camera is different, and it's your responsibility to figure out how high you can crank that ISO before the image starts to fall apart on your particular camera. When I first purchase a camera, the first thing that I always do is find out where the image starts to fall apart on my camera when I crank up that ISO. And then I'll make sure that my auto exposure is set to that number on the ISO as to never cross over that threshold. That way I'm sure that my camera won't be taking any unusable shots that when I get home I'll realize it's all too grainy. That's why I think it's always important to play back your videos while you're still on set so you can have a good gauge of how your videos will look. But sometimes those little displays on our cameras aren't big enough and we can't see all of the imperfections until we get inside on our big computers. That's one of the reasons I would recommend picking up a monitor. I can tell you that I've been there where I got home from a shoot thinking that everything was exposed perfectly. And then once I put it onto my computer, I realized there was a lot that was not. But that's okay, I've learned, and now I want to teach you so that you don't make those same mistakes. So that's why it's important for you to know your exposure settings and know your surrounding environment. It's also why we really shouldn't be using auto exposure unless there's no other choice. I do use auto ISO sometimes when I'm in a fast-paced environment, but ideally I like to set my cameras to the lowest ISO they could go, or even sometimes it's native ISO. We'll talk about that in a little bit. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. The lower the sensitivity or the lower the ISO, the better quality video you will have. The higher the sensitivity or the higher the ISO, the less quality of an image you will get. You can think about this like someone who's in distress. The more stressed out someone might be, the worse quality decision they're gonna make. Whereas the more calm and cool and collected someone is, the better quality decision they will make. When a camera sensor is at its lowest sensitivity, aka its base ISO, it can produce the cleanest and highest quality photo and video. We don't want to stress out our cameras by setting the ISOs too high. We're really not stressing out our camera, but that's just an analogy to help you better understand. A lot of cameras' base ISO starts at about 50 or 100, but if you want to shoot with log footage, then you'll want to shoot with the camera's specific base ISO, which is usually higher, like 640 or 800 or 1250, depending on the brand that you're using. That's because log profiles are designed to capture more dynamic range, but they need more light to do it cleanly. If you shoot log at too low of an ISO, your footage might end up looking noisy or flat. And in a way, that's a lot harder to recover in post-production. So just check your camera specs and always make sure you're using the proper base ISO for the picture profile or the color profile that you're shooting in. That's the best way to get clean, flexible footage that actually holds up in your color grade. This would be a good time to start talking about basing out your camera. It's always best to start your camera at its base settings and then adjust it up from there. Having your camera based out will ensure that your camera is set to optimal performance. To base out your camera for a video, we first need to figure out what frame rate we will be shooting in. For interviews and talking type shots like this, I like to shoot in 24 frames per second. This is going to provide me the most realistic look with just enough motion blur to make it look natural or cinematic. If you're shooting in a different country, then your frame rate might be 25 frames per second. For something that I might slow down later in post-production, like some B-roll, I'll shoot that in 60 frames per second. For something that I'm definitely going to slow down in post-production, I'll shoot that in 120 frames per second. Either way, once you pick your frame rate, you can set your shutter speed. And we want to use the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180-degree shutter rule states that your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, then you should change your shutter speed to 1/48. And if your shutter speed doesn't go to 1/48, then do the next best thing, maybe 1/50. If I'm shooting in 60 frames per second, then I'm gonna change my shutter speed to 1/125. And if you stick to this rule, you should be fine. But these rules can be broken. I've done it a lot in the past. I just don't like to stray too far away because that's when you can introduce some of those weird looking videos that I showed you earlier. I find that when I'm shooting 24 frames per second, I can take the shutter speed down to about 1/25 before I really start to see that stuttery effect. It's good to know how low you can go to take your shutter speed before you start to see that stutter, because you might be shooting in an office building where they have fluorescent lights, and usually I find that the lower my shutter speed, the less likely I'll be able to see that flicker. But if I was shooting in 60 frames per second, then I would end up with stuttery looking footage. But of course, after I'm done shooting that shot in 24 frames per second with the shutter speed of 1/25, I'll watch it back to make sure all of my footage looks good before I proceed. Resolution is just the number of pixels in your video, and more pixels mean more detail, but that doesn't always mean better. The most common resolution nowadays is 4K, but 1080 is still more than enough for most content, especially if you're just uploading to YouTube or social media like this. If you want a little bit more flexibility, like cropping in post-production without losing quality, then shooting in 4K is a great option. It gives you more room to work with, but keep in mind that it does take up more storage and can slow down your editing if your computer's not built for it. Now, a resolution that we've seen from the past is 720p, which is actually making a comeback with a lot of people who like to shoot that camcorder look. By the way, I did make camera-specific camcorder LUTs, so if you're interested in that look, I'll leave a link to that LUT in the description. And cameras can also shoot in 8K and even higher than that, but for most creators, 4K is the ceiling, at least as of the time of recording this video, and 1080 may be your sweet spot. Just remember, resolution doesn't matter if your lighting and exposure are off. Audio is one of those things that people don't think about until it's too late, but it's way more important than your video quality in a lot of people's opinions. You can get away with a slightly blurry shot, but if your audio sounds like it was recorded inside of a trash can, people are going to click out. Built-in camera mics are fine for reference, but you really want to use an external mic, like a shotgun mic, like I'm using right now, to make sure your audio sounds the best. This is what the sound sounds like if I'm not using a professional mic and it's about 3 feet away from my face. So you can see how much of a difference it makes when you use professional audio compared to something like one of those smaller mics you get in your smartphone. Also, the environment that you're filming in also plays a huge role. The quieter it is, the better. So no refrigerators in the background, no air conditioners right above you, or just turn the air conditioner off during the duration of your headshot. And if you're outside and there's background noise, a lav mic will work great. Your voice will be closer to the source and it cuts through all of that background noise. Clean and clear audio will make your video that much better. And it's way harder to fix bad audio than it is to fix bad or underexposed shots with video. Camera movement can make your video feel dynamic and cinematic, or totally distracting and unnatural if it's not done right. The key is to move with intention. If you're just hand-holding and walking around with no plan, it's going to look kind of like a home video. But if you use smooth and controlled movements like slow pushes and pulls and pans, it can add emotion and depth to your shot. A tripod gives you the most stability, especially for interviews and static shots like this. But if you want to add motion, I highly recommend picking up a gimbal or even just hand-holding your camera for some of those tighter shots, and sometimes that natural handheld look looks great. You don't need fancy gear to get good movement. You just need to think about why you're moving and what that movement is adding to your story. Less is usually more. One of the biggest things that separates amateur looking video from something that feels more intentional is planning your shots. And no, that doesn't mean you need a big production schedule or a fancy storyboard to plan your shots. It can be as simple as just thinking ahead about what you want to capture and how. The basics are usually a wide shot to set the scene, a medium shot to give context, and a close-up for detail or emotion. That simple mix-up can turn even a basic talking head video like this into something that feels more structured and professional. Also, I like to watch other people's videos and then reference some of their shots, how they did it, and then either try to mimic it or reference it as I go. When you don't plan, you end up scrambling, missing key angles or things that you might have been thinking about, or settling for footage that doesn't really tell the full story. I've done entire shoots where I thought I had everything, only to realize in the editing room that I forgot to get a simple reaction shot or a transition clip. This happens all the time. Even just jotting down a few shot ideas on your phone or a piece of paper before you press record can save you a lot of hassle once you get to the editing room. All right, so if you've made it this far, you now have a solid foundation that covers 85% of what you really need to know to shoot great looking video. The rest just comes down to practice, reviewing your footage, and building your confidence over time. And if you're ready to go deeper, definitely check out my Camera Basics for Beginners Video 101 course. It's designed to walk you through everything step by step so you actually understand your camera, not just memorize the settings. Thanks for watching this video. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thanks for watching.